Okay, and if I could just say how fantastic it is to have Marianne to speak to us. Um, Andy and I have had this in planning for a little while, so we're glad we found a date. Um, and some of you will know Marianne, who is a former chair of Labour Housing Group and a founder member. And she's worked in tenant participation, tenant empowerment for a very long time. And what we've asked her to do is to look at the social housing regulation bill and say basically what she thinks of it, and ask the question: will it improve tenant empowerment? And then say what the Labour Party, the Labour government should do, and what Labour-controlled councils and Labour councils themselves can do. And there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. So, Marianne.
Right, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me to come and do this in conversation session. I just want to begin by reminding us why participation and tenant empowerment is essential in relation to developing and delivering successful housing policies and strategies. Policies and strategies to ensure everyone has the right not just to a roof over their head, but to a safe, secure, affordable home. And I want to quote the UN Special Rapporteur on Housing, who said, "Participation is central to human rights-based housing strategies because it challenges exclusions and silencing." And not only does genuine, effective tenant participation empower people who are often marginalised and excluded to make sure that they have their voices heard, it also leads to better planning and design decisions, better use of scarce resources, and helps ensure that costly mistakes, costly both in terms of social and financial impacts, are not repeated. In the context of a Labour Housing Group discussion, I'm taking it as read that we all agree with what I've just said, but please feel free to challenge me. However, does everyone actually understand what tenant empowerment is all about and what it means and how it can be put into practice? The government's social housing regulation bill, based on the white paper, the so-called Charter for Social Housing, says it aims to ensure residents' voices are heard, that social housing landlords are more accountable to their tenants with effective tenant engagement, improved consumer standards, and redress for tenants when things go wrong. The government says the bill will strengthen accountability of landlords to tenants, but how exactly? I've searched this bill. In 1995, Lord Nolan, in his report of the Committee in Standards on Public Life, said, "The term accountability is used in a variety of different ways, some of them rather loose and ill-defined. On a more precise definition, service providers and others are truly accountable only to those able to exercise sanctions over them." So, are tenants going to be able to exercise sanctions over their landlords? Will it be possible, under the measures in the bill, for tenants to really hold their landlords to account? I really don't think so. I can't find this anywhere. This bill doesn't give direct rights to tenants. It gives them to the regulator. The social housing regulator has the power to exercise sanctions over landlords, but tenants have no such direct rights. In the bill, social housing tenants and prospective tenants are referred to and seen as consumers to be consulted. But tenants and prospective tenants have little or no choice about who their landlord is or how their services are delivered. They're hardly consumers. If they don't like the service, they can't say, "Oh, I'll go somewhere else." The Tories talk about tenant empowerment and accountability to tenants, but remember, their bill was introduced in the wake of the shockwaves that went through the housing world following the Grenfell Tower fire. It's therefore not surprising that there's an emphasis on listening to tenants and on taking action over safety issues, but you'll search in vain for any actual measures to give direct powers to tenants. The bill is supposed to give tenants greater access to information and easier access to the Housing Ombudsman, and it probably does do that, and to redress when it may do that, I'm not sure. But it's the social housing regulator who must oversee consumer regulations on their behalf. And don't forget, it's the Tories who want as much deregulation as possible. If better, more effective standards and regulations had been in place and had been enforced, we might not have had the Grenfell disaster in the first place. And we've heard similar words in the past about tenants as consumers having choice over how their housing services are delivered. Who remembers tenants' choice and voluntary transfers and the sale of council estates? And although it was a Tory government who brought in the first tenants' charter in 1980, they scrapped it completely 8 years later. Before Labour took over in 1997, the Tories talked tenant participation, but as the then National Director of the Tenant Participation Advisory Service for England, I can assure you that they saw tenants as pawns in the game to remove housing from the democratic control of local authorities. It was the Labour government in 1997 that gave genuine regulatory and financial support for tenant involvement and empowerment, with a Tenant Services Authority and a National Tenants Voice, both immediately disbanded by the incoming Tory coalition government. I think we need to be very aware of the direction in which the Tories, via this bill, really want to take us. Does anyone believe that this government actually wants tenants to have genuine influence and power? That would mean some collective involvement as well, and they certainly aren't into that. Is it really credible that a Tory government who have proposals waiting to be implemented to end security of tenure, who emphasise and encourage moving from rent to ownership, it's there in the bill again, and who starve all social landlords of the resources they need, not only to improve existing homes, but also to build much needed, genuinely affordable homes for the future? Is it credible that such a government really wants tenants to be empowered? The white paper that gave rise to the current housing bill, in that white paper, the then minister, Robert Jenrick, said, "I want tenants to feel empowered." Note, he said feel empowered, not be empowered. It's all smoke and mirrors with the Tories. And what this bill certainly does do is encourage tenants to find fault, to find things that are wrong. And we've been there before. That was how tenants' choice was being packaged. Oh, go and find a better landlord. Your landlord must be rubbish. Go and find a better one. Absolutely not what most tenants wanted. So, does this bill have anything positive to offer to tenants? Well, I think the answer is not really, but, with a big but, the emphasis on accountability of landlords to tenants and to tenant empowerment should actually be seized upon by Labour to demonstrate what could and should be done. We need to make sure that tenants understand the difference in approach between Labour and the Tories and what it is that's really needed to empower tenants and how it can be put into practice. And there are actions that can be taken by Labour control councils, Labour councillors and Labour Party activists. First, to expose the lack of real rights for tenants in this bill, and then to make sure that all tenants, no matter who they are, that their voices can really be heard, not the ones just with the sharpest elbows. But we need to make sure that policies and procedures and support and resources are in place. First of all, to ensure that it's tenants' views that shape the provision, management and maintenance of their homes, to enable tenants to influence decision-making and priorities of their housing provider, and then to rebalance the landlord-tenant relationship to make sure that social housing landlords are genuinely accountable to their tenants. If your council or other social housing providers with whom you're involved don't have clear policies and procedure, get together with tenants and tenants' representatives and get them developed and put into place. And if you do have policies and procedures in place, get together with tenants to check that they're working properly from their perspective. Ask tenants about their priorities, and where tough choices have to be made, what is it that matters most to them? Tenants may not be the professionals when it comes to their homes, but they're definitely the experts who can say what does and doesn't work. And if tenants are really to be able to have a say and influence over the decision of their housing services, good quality, accessible information is of paramount importance. Good quality two-way information and communication is absolutely central to tenant empowerment and accountability. If they don't have such information, and by the way, the information should be developed with tenants themselves, then they're not going to be able to have effective input to shaping and improving their housing services. You need to check whether or not people understand what all this is about, what the financial challenges are about, the options and choices that are possible, and possibilities for action. Actually, you probably need to check with staff and councillors as well to make sure that they understand what all this is about and what the possibilities are. And then find out from tenants how they want to be involved in monitoring services, how they want to be involved and how they can be involved in policy development, and then what sort of action, including redress, should be taken when things go wrong. We do have examples of how this can be done. Just turning back the pages of history, compacts were tools that were brought in by the last Labour government. I could probably bore for Britain on this. And they had clear requirements for all social housing landlords to develop agreements, because that's what compacts were, with their tenants. And they were very effective. I hope that many of these are still in place, but I don't know how many have been scrapped by housing associations. Compacts proposed very clearly defined standards in relation to involving tenants, including standards for support and resources. There's absolutely nothing in the Tories' social housing regulation bill which gives any such direct support and resources to tenants. That's absolutely essential to involving tenants. How can tenants get involved if they don't have any support or resources? So here's another opportunity for Labour councils, Labour councillors, Labour Party activists and members to make sure that social housing landlords are giving tenants the support they need, including support for collective action and the development of tenants groups. And I know it can be challenging to involve tenants in redress and sanctions in relation to poor performance and failure to deliver good services. But one of the things that this bill does introduce is stiff fines from the social regulator for landlords who fail to meet the regulator's service standards. And the bill also enables tenants to have more direct access to the Housing Ombudsman, which, by the way, they used to have, and to get their complaints dealt with. I would argue that it's far better to design and develop your own in-house complaints procedures and your own in-house redress and compensation schemes. And it should include tackling complaints from both individual tenants and collective complaints from tenants' groups. And when necessary, redress and compensation should be provided. If such procedures are developed in-house, and I've been involved, and I'll give a few examples in a minute of how that can be done. And if these procedures are simple and swift and work for tenants, they're far more likely to use those than to go to outside bodies, including the no-win, no-fee lawyers. And that's better for everyone. I'll give an example of in-house tribunals. I used to propose in-house tribunals to go into compacts, but looking at a well-tried model where you have a body that's slightly removed from the actual housing officers, involving representatives of the tenants, representatives of the landlord, but also representatives from voluntary sector bodies who are active in the area, who work with tenants and residents groups. And I used to say a third, a third, a third. And tenants obviously having an in-house complaints procedure, but that's got to be designed by tenants so that it's effective and they don't just give up because it's just too difficult to go through. And if people have those sort of very difficult procedures, then they'll get caught by the social housing regulator, because it's clear that that's what the bill is going to be looking at. You know, are you exhausting your tenants in trying to make a complaint? And the ones that I worked with, we developed a very, very simple complaints procedure, and a tenant's representative could take the complaint if necessary. If it wasn't resolved, it would go to the tribunal, and the agreement via the compact, which was a formal contract agreement. I don't think you could have taken it to court, but it was a formal agreement, said, okay, and the tribunal's decision will be binding, and they can say, right, here's what you've got to do, landlord, within this time scale. Here's compensation and redress you've got to pay out if necessary. And in several occasions, I persuaded the Housing Ombudsman to become involved in a situation where the tribunal had made a ruling with timescales for action, but then it wasn't implemented. And in several of the agreements, including South Lakes, where's Don? South Lakes and Carrick, they said, okay, the Ombudsman will come in, he'll make a ruling, and that will be absolutely binding. And of course, it was the Ombudsman, so it was the sort of iron fist in the velvet glove. A much more simple approach, and going back quite a long way, but I think it began to be common in quite a few social landlords, was where there were little niggly repairs that really upset tenants, but in the scale of things, they're just not that urgent. A small parts scheme, I think the first time I saw this was in Tameside. And so tenants who had just things that weren't working that could be fixed by them or a friend or a member of their family or another tenant could go to the landlord with the details of the complaint, the repair, because obviously the landlord needs to check, is this happening in all our homes, and then pick up whatever it was, tap washers, sink plugs, I mean, any small things where it was easy to do the repair yourself. In fact, one group of tenants I worked with, their landlord had set up a sort of handyman scheme as well, so that those little niggly repairs, which drive tenants mad when they take too long, could actually be done quickly. I still think the best repair scheme ever was one that we developed in Brent, where it was terribly formal. There were exact time scales for all the different repairs, and tenants had a copy of what they'd reported. If it wasn't done within that time scale, and for emergency repairs, it could be 24 hours. Oh, by the way, we developed and agreed this with the direct labour force. Then the tenant went back. In those days, it was a bit of paper, carbonless copying paper, because we didn't have our wonderful computer systems. And the tenant went back and said, this hasn't been done. Here's my copy of the details of what should have been done. The time scale to get an emergency then dealt with was 24 hours, but for others, there were 5 days. If after that time, it was a bit cumbersome, tenant had to go back and say, right, okay, time's up. There was then a list of approved contractors who were approved by the landlord, and the landlord had set up an agreement with them that they would go in and do the work and get paid. Interestingly, the director of direct works from Brent, who hated us with an intense passion, actually came along a year later and said, that was the best scheme ever. It went through our workforce like a dose of salts. We were determined that nobody would ever go to an outside contractor. And it's true, it changed it. So, I mean, those are just some of the examples in relation to repairs, because this bill is very clearly looking at getting tenants to make complaints and to go after compensation. And that's just leaching money out of a precious resource that should be doing much more than that. So where do we go from here in responding to the bill? Well, I suggest that Labour controlled councils, Labour councillors, party activists should seize this opportunity to show what genuine tenant engagement and empowerment is all about, and to step up to the challenge of developing more accessible, swift and simple in-house procedures to provide tenants with redress and compensation when service standards fail to meet the promises and when things go wrong for tenants. In relation to the Labour Party and our policies, we need to put engagement and empowerment of not only tenants but communities at the heart of our policies, because this is about ensuring we deliver fairness and inclusion for everyone. Perhaps the most essential policy to restate is that we believe in the right of tenants to have a safe, secure, affordable home. We need to implement the proposals for tenure reform developed under our last Labour government to make sure that security of tenure becomes a reality for all tenants. The Tory government plans to make it impossible to offer long-term secure tenancies haven't been implemented, but they're still waiting in the wings. Labour-controlled councils should be using all powers available to them to make sure that short-term, so-called flexible tenancies are completely outlawed in their area. And Labour must make its commitment to tenure reform very clear. Next, we need to continue to develop our policies to support tenant involvement and empowerment, including giving recognition to tenants' organisations at both local and national level, and to make sure that tenants are involved in developing housing policies and strategies at both local and national level. And this should include a commitment to providing the support and resources needed to make sure all tenants can take part in shaping the provision, management and maintenance of their homes and in influencing the decision-making where they live. The Tories have encouraged housing associations to move away from being locally democratic controlled bodies who can be genuinely accountable to their tenants. We need to make sure we've got policies in place to make sure all social landlords can be held to account by their tenants. Membership schemes of housing associations are a really good way of doing that. And by the way, there's nothing in law to prevent that. Although if you're a PLC, then it gets kind of difficult. And all social housing landlords should enable their tenants to be involved in all aspects of their housing. Finally, our policies must centre on inclusion, engagement and empowerment of everyone, especially those who are often most excluded and marginalised. The Labour Party's always supported community development and engagement and the development of things such as cooperative housing, community-controlled housing and community land trusts as ways of ensuring affordable housing and involvement of the community in perpetuity, and we must continue to do so. Our housing policies need to be about not only engaging and empowering tenants and prospective tenants, but also engaging local communities to make sure that current and future needs can be met and that mistakes of the past are not repeated. Above all, our housing policies must reflect our commitment to justice, fairness and equality for all, including those who are often the most marginalised and excluded in our society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic run through of what we should be doing and what the Tories aren't doing. I've got quite a few questions myself. I thought I might, if people don't mind, just start by asking a couple of them. I wondered if you could just, in case there's anybody who doesn't know, just explain what the Tenant Services Authority did and what Tenants' Voice was meant to be.
Okay. Well, the Tenant Services Authority actually was what the name said on the tin. It was there acting for tenants on service to make sure that service standards that have been shaped and prioritised by tenants were maintained. once upon a time we had the Audit Commission who used to be able to go in, and they didn't just go in looking for what was wrong. They also went in looking for what was working. They wrote some absolute great reports saying, look, here's what you can do, and here's the things that aren't so good. And the Tenant Services Authority, well, that was what it was. It was tenant focused. It was for tenants. Tenants' Voice, which took quite a time to try and get developed. I mean, I started off way back in the 70s trying to create a national tenants organisation, National Tenants' Voice, that actually was about to be launched. The tenants were there, the representatives had been set up. And again, it was to be a national body that would have input to policies at a national level. In Sweden, I don't know if it's been abolished because they've gone quite a long way over to the right, but certainly in Sweden, the Swedish Tenants Organisation was part of the government, and the Swedish Tenants Organisation actually helped to set policies. They also were the body who set rent levels across the piece. There's absolutely no reason why we can't have a similar thing here.
I didn't know that. The Tenants' Voice, of course, was supported, the development of it was supported by our own Steve Hilditch, another founder member of Labour Housing Group. But it was devastating when that was abolished just after the Tories came in. Terrible.
It's never going to see the light of day under the Tories.
No. I think my other question was just that, as far as I can gather, a lot of housing associations have got rid of tenants on their boards. Is that right? And are there any left that do have them?
I got so frustrated. As you know, Sheila, I decided I would leave this world for a bit because I was fed up with the nightmares. I don't know. I know there are some that are left that do still have tenants on their board. I guess the ones who wanted to go down the road of floating themselves, as PLCs, then that becomes far more difficult. There's actually no impediment in law whatsoever tenants having a full role. I actually had a free half-hour well, it wasn't a consultation because he was just spelling it all out to me with one of the leading law lords who pointed out that all the arguments about conflict of interest were absolute total bosh. And tenants can most definitely form part of the management of their housing. Obviously, if it's a co-op, they can be running it. And in Scotland, we had the model. We had the housing. I hope we've still got them. The housing association model, where the housing associations were run by the tenants.
Right, we have a question to start us off from Alan.
Right, sorry, I couldn't find the button there. Yeah. Thanks for that, Marianne. There's a lot of thought-provoking stuff you've mentioned, and I think a lot of it is fairly common sense, I would say, in terms of the engagement and empowerment of tenants. But I used to be a cabinet member for housing in the last Labour controlled council in Northumberland. So I actually set up Northumberland Tenants' Voice. That was against the resistance of officers, I have to say, but nonetheless it went through. And they were really good because they had, I think, real influence on some of the decisions and policies that we made. So things like the complaints procedure was changed as a consequence of their input. Some of the policies on, for example, house building, because we built about 350 new council houses in that time, were changed, and that really is effective.
Yeah.
One of the issues that I think, the 2 points, and Sheila's prompted me to ask about housing associations. I believe they've lost their social mission, by the way. They just, we talk about social tenants, but there's a lot of them in the housing association sector. And I think we have to focus on those too.
Yeah.
In terms of the thing that concerns me most is the social housing image. Yeah. And that is the tenure of last resort, whenever you see a TV programme, the things that rare as a council estate, you know, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of things we can do in terms of improving that, because I think that's a real block on the kind of image in terms of the public there. They see it as the last resort.
Yeah.
The other point I think is in terms of what I mentioned earlier, Marianne, which was about direct influence. It's well and good talking about empowerment and engagement, but how should we give real influence to tenants to actually change things? And I would love to see that in a Labour government policy.
Yeah. I agree with you about the image. I mean, I was one of the Labour Housing Group people who said, you know, what we're creating is residual welfare housing, poor housing for poor people. And I always remember one tenant at a conference stood up and said, we're being punished, and our punishment is our housing, and our only crime is that we're poor. However, I have to say, during all the time I worked at TPAS and then the years afterwards as an independent advisor and as chair of the Beacon scheme, there are some absolutely smashing examples around the country of social housing. It's across the piece. It's in local authorities and housing associations where tenants have been involved, have made a huge difference, and the end result is superb. And one of the best performers, and it's not just me saying this, I might be totally biased because I worked with the tenants, but they won all sorts of awards and they got a Beacon before they were absorbed into a larger authority. And that was Carrick Housing, because they had a director of housing who wasn't at all afraid about the tenants having direct influence. He absolutely encouraged them to get involved and made sure that they could take part. And in fact, one of the ways of involving tenants in a local authority that's not an arm's length management organisation, because it's slightly more difficult. You've got, you know, legal structures and the councillor's role. But what you can do is to take a very clear policy decision that the way that you will work is that you will have a subgroup that advise and direct the policies, and that the housing committee or whatever body you've got within your structure will follow those recommendations. And what I always encourage tenants to do is to make sure they turn up at the meeting and just lean forward and watch whilst the decisions are being taken. Now that's accountability. That's about being able to challenge and question and then watch and see if people are coming up with what you've proposed. And so it can be done. It doesn't matter whether it's a housing association or a local authority. I think there's going to be a problem. I deliberately stepped away. Kay Andrews said, set up, you know, PLCs over my dead body. And I must say, I felt the same way about housing associations, but there are still some good ones around. There are still some small ones, and there are housing co-ops. I don't know what we do about the ones that have gone astray. They will come unstuck. When you look at the costly mistakes, the design mistakes, I mean, that's the thing that screams out at me. And I get kind of worried when we talk about, oh, we're going to build all these houses. Oh, yes. And how are we going to make sure that tenants influence what it is that we build, how we design it, how we do it? I used to be invited to go and give talks to the Institute of Advanced Architectural Studies, because I had no idea that you could qualify as an architect and never have to learn how to design a house. I mean, that just seemed bonkers to me, but there certainly were enough people within the architectural world who really believed in community-based housing and community involvement. Some excellent housing, I hope it's still around, in Liverpool, where the tenants actually did a cartoon of their architect. They did him as a pencil being held by one of the tenants. Poor old Bill had a bald head and they'd made it into a pencil point and they were writing with him. What a phenomenal compliment to give to an architect who's trying to make sure it's tenants who direct what they do. Sorry, that was a bit of a ramble. So, I mean, I think that there are mechanisms, structures that you can put in place to make sure that tenants have influence, even if you're a housing authority. And yes, some of the officers might scream blue murder, and some of them might leave. But in my experience, there'll also be officers who will turn up 6 months later and say, God, that was a bloody good idea. I'm so glad we did that. Because it is tenants who know what works. And when you have really difficult choices to make, then let the tenants have their head. I remember doing a meeting in Liverpool when they were bankrupt. It was hopeless. And the housing officer, a young woman, was really frightened. She was shaking. She said, I can't tell them what the situation is. I said, well, I think they already know. And so she described the awful choices they got with the resources they got left. And one wonderful woman tenant rolled her sleeves up and said, let's just get on with it then. I mean, I think that's the practical attitude, but you've got to make sure that you've put the policies in place to have those structures, and then you've got to resource them. It's not fair to expect the tenants to do this with no resources, and they've got to have good quality information, and you've got to test and check that the information is working for them. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer, Sheila. You know me, you should.
No, that's fine. That's good. There were a lot of points made in Alison. Sorry, I'll just. Someone's trying to ring me. Is there who wants to ask something next? Chris.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the almost privilege, I'd say, of listening to somebody's synthesized experience over so many decades. It's just wonderful to see such coherence. And it seemed to me that almost everything you said was more or less a no-brainer, which we should all know. Yes. And therefore that it's pretty much what we want today is very consistent with what we've wanted in the past. I note the Tories seem brilliant in making changes which are hard to undo. So I do wish somebody would take our changes and somehow embed them so securely in our daily lives that even a weird new trussed up government wouldn't be able to change them. But my question really is about who should be doing this? Because in my Labour Council and on my large estate, we have 3 brilliant local councillors, 2 of whom are on the council cabinet, so have a lot of power. And although they keep telling me, oh, well, the tenants are the experts, you're the only ones who know everything, in fact, they conduct surgeries. They see a far greater number of tenants than I ever could as a member of the committees and on the core customer group. And it seems to me that they have the backing of what we don't have, which is a mandate. So in a way, looking at it from that perspective, direct tenant involvement seems to cut out the councillors and seems therefore to be seditious.
Right, I'm tempted to take that one first, but I'll come back to it because I've quite a bit to say in it. The bit about how to embed it, you're absolutely right. But the bill hasn't gone through yet, and I suspect this bill won't go through because I can't quite see, are they going to create enough parliamentary time? I mean, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that they haven't got enough parliamentary time and that they won't have. Come on, you know, we need a general election. But the way that you make sure things are embedded, well, I'll tell you how you don't do it. And it was the mistake that Labour made. And we could have had the parliamentary time to get a proper act onto the statute books, but we used regulation. And regulations can be thrown out. Regulations can be changed and overturned. It's easy to change regulations. It's much more difficult. Well, it's very, very difficult to overturn statutes. And it was originally the 1980 Housing Act that gave all the rights to tenants to consultation, although critically, it did not include what tenants had wanted, and that was to be consulted about financial matters. When the Tories brought in their tenants' charter in 1980, it specifically left that out. And I would say, and therein lies the root of our problems, and you can see the dominoes go down. So we've got to have statute We've absolutely got to have statute, and that's up to the Labour Party to fulfil its commitment. I mean, for God's sake, I worked for so blinking long on trying to get the tenure reform. Oh, by the way, in Scotland, they do have, I'm longing to say my model tenancy, but I wasn't the only one working on it. But I wrote the original thing for the Chartered Institute of Housing. You've got to get it into statute. However, if it's not in statute, then regulations, but the aim has got to be statute. That's for the party, that's for Labour in government. At local level, I think I'd want to argue with you about ruling tenants out. I think it's much more about councillors just doing a bit of a rethink and thinking, how can we be working in partnership with our tenants, because they've got expertise and skills to offer, and so have we. And yes, they might see people in their surgeries that the tenants don't see. But at local level, if you're involving tenants, there's an awful lot more eyes and ears and hands to help than councillors have got. And I think the sort of arrangements where you create bodies where the tenants and the councillors come together and discuss what needs to be done. And then the councillors have got to have the courage of their convictions and say, okay, that's what we're taking forward. And that's why I recommend having something, a body, and I've lost track of where we are with all the local government regulations, but a body that can still exist within the council structure that can refer things to the Housing Committee. My understanding is that there still isn't anything to prohibit that. The only thing that prohibits it is the political will of the people in charge. So I don't think, in fact, far from taking the mandate away from councillors, I think if you can get them working in partnership, you've got a much better deal. And I know quite a few tenants who always used to say, oh, I don't want to get involved in politics, I don't want to get in politics. And lo and behold, they became councillors. And one or two of them ended up being chairs of housing. I think that would be my perfect model for the future.
So would a councillor chair a tenants' voice committee, the ideal tenants' voice committee?
Well, I think that you'd have to discuss that with the tenants. Maybe it could be a joint venture. I used to be co-chair with the Minister of the Voluntary and Community Sector Partnership Board. The Tories came in, that was just a disaster. But it was a really nice arrangement with Kay Andrews. That worked really well. Sometimes tenants need help to be able to come forward. They're not necessarily that confident. If you've not done anything like this before, if you've not operated in that arena, you do need a bit of support. So maybe having a co-chairing arrangement would work very well. And then if the councillors feel happy and comfortable, they could hand over. But I don't think it would be a good idea to expect tenants to rise up to it if they haven't had any of that experience. Now, some of them might, but if they haven't had, it really is quite daunting. I used to have to go and pick up the tenant who later actually became the councillor and take her to the meetings, because if I hadn't gone and picked her up, she wouldn't have gone. She was a single mum who had had a horrendous life. I tell you, some of the best tenant activists peel back the cover and you don't want to look at their lives. So they've got phenomenal life experience. And if we can just give them that confidence, then I think they can really improve our services. Sorry, that was another round.
No, thank you. That's a powerful argument. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Who's next?
Oh, I like questions. Can't I have some more questions?
There's not anybody else got any burning ones. I've got a couple more. Well, I wondered if you could just say a little bit about the beacon scheme.
Right.
And then Andy has a question.
Well, it didn't start off that well. And actually, the person who was the chair before me, right at the start, was the very person who had set me on my route way back in the 70s in Brent, persuading me to become secretary of the Brent Tenants and Residents Federation, because he was off to be chair of the Trades Council, and that was Jack Dromey. The Beacon scheme, actually, you have to turn the clock back a bit further. And Nick Rainsford told me I can definitely bore for Britain on best value. And people hated best value. What a brilliant idea. Best value. What's at the heart of it? Involvement and engagement of the people who are receiving whatever those services are. And then making sure that you have standards. And I can remember doing lots of training sessions on this, saying, yeah, you do need targets because you're meant to try and hit your target. Once you can hit your target all the time, that's your new standard. And now you go for a higher target. And that's how you improve services. And at the heart of that, the community, whether it was tenants for housing, whether it was children and teachers and boards of governors in schools, had to show that they're involved. And the Beacon scheme picked up on all of that. And the idea was to try and improve the performance and also the image. I mean, the point about the image of social housing, to improve the image of local authorities. And when it started, local authorities' image was very, very poor. And there were loads of reports, you know, showing how their performance was poor. As I chaired it over, God, I've forgotten how many years it was now. It was 2009, so it must have been seven years. The standard, that the way it went up was really quite phenomenal. And how can I sort of prove that? Well, have a look at our criteria, how they changed from, well, certainly 2002 when I was first in contact. And each year we looked at, so, you know, what is it that needs to be improved? And looking at feedback from as wide as possible. We used to hold workshops and say, you know, what do you think is most important to be improving? And then looking at how it could be done. The thing about the Beacon scheme was it wasn't a sort of one-off award for one. It was about discovering and promoting excellence and exemplars. And they were given a chunk of money so that they could go and help others to do whatever it was, or to learn about whatever they'd done. In the north, in the mills, they call it sitting with Nelly. So you find out, you know, how to do these different things. And I'm saying it was brilliant. Warwick University did a study, and in fact, they said absolutely brilliant. It was picked up around the world. I mean, I went out to Bosnia to work with the councils there. The thing about it was you were looking for what worked, and they had to prove it. They had to prove from the bottom to the top. And if we got a presentation and it was just the chief exec and the council leader, well, they'd failed before they started, because we needed to see that there was a commitment and buy-in throughout the organisation. And it was about not sort of saying, oh, this is terrible. Okay, we've made a mistake. Now, what can we learn from it? And I know some people don't like Greenwich, but I was just so impressed by the staff at Greenwich who were bouncing up and down to tell me about, well, this is what happened. And look, this is what we did. And do you know, I went and said, this isn't working. And here's what we did to put it right. That was what was clever about the Beacon scheme. It was about looking for what's working, promoting, publicising. When I first was chair, the awards ceremony was absolutely pathetic. I mean, here you are trying to promote what local authorities have done, and who knows about it? So I got it changed, and it became a big awards ceremony in the QE2. I suppose, you know, at the end, it was the pièce de résistance. We had 10 themes, and therefore potentially it's a minister for each theme. And I'm still not quite sure how it was we ended up with 12 ministers coming, but we did have 12 ministers coming to give the award. And it encouraged staff. I mean, the staff who were in the Beacon, and it wasn't just councils, it was fire authorities, national parks, police, oh God, who else were best value authorities? Anyway, I mean, they were sort of bouncing up and down because nobody had said before, oh, what you're doing is absolutely super.
Yeah.
Show us. Yes. How you do it. If you want to improve your performance, and you know, in housing, it's exactly the same, then you make sure that you're really publicising and promoting the things that work. And obviously with the housing themes, they had to prove to me that the tenants really had been involved. But we had some great ones in rural areas. And Actually, it was across the political spectrum. There might have been more Labour controlled councils. There probably were. Interestingly, the rural one, one of the best ones, it was well, it was supposed to be a Conservative controlled authority, but the more I talked to the woman who was the leader, I thought, you're in the wrong party, mate. You know, you're into involving the community and having accessible housing. But it didn't matter. What we were looking for was making sure that no matter how you tested it, from what angle, this was going to hold up as an exemplar that others could learn from. And what Warwick University said, it wasn't about adoption. Jean invented a word. It was about adaption. So you adapted what you had got with the help of the people from that authority. And the grant, the award that they got helped to backfill posts whilst people went off, promoting what they were doing.
Thank you. Andy.
Yeah, but thanks for a great talk, Marianne. I wanted to talk about the challenges, or sorry, ask you about the challenges of tenant engagement in 2022. So I think lots of us in the call have been around when there was kind of more of a tradition of tenant engagement through meetings, and there was kind of stronger links between tenant reps and the Labour Party, and more direct links between tenant reps and kind of significant politicians, and that's kind of drifted away from us over the last 10 years or so. So, but for instance, I manage a tenant managed organisation, and our chair and vice chair, so we've got the vice chair on the call today, but they both kind of took over from their parents. So one of the parents was previously involved, and then they got involved, and that kind of tradition's gone. So women have kind of always got involved in tenants organisations, but there's also kind of a male tradition through the trade unions that have kind of been lost as well. So it's kind of how, sorry, it's a rambling question, but it's kind of how we engage better with residents in 2022.
I think I have always advocated using as many different means as possible. And I can see Don Simpson sitting there, and he knows I'm a complete IT illiterate, but I mean, I do try. Clearly, social media is a whole new way of involving people. But what is really interesting is that when you talk to people literally in the street, what most people really like is that human contact. I mean, I was told that one of the downsides of events like this is, oh, what about all those nice chats we used to have over the tea and bickies afterwards, or the glass of wine afterwards? There's an awful lot to be said for creating opportunities for that direct human interaction. But when it comes to helping to disseminate information and people getting to know people, then clearly social media is a super tool. But I'm thinking of so many initiatives, and quite often, I suppose maybe it was what flagged up interest to me, centered around food. So I remember one organization who said, we've got lots and lots of different ethnic groups in our area, and we really don't know much about them. So we've decided we're going to set up, in the north we call it Jacob's Join, where you ask people to bring along a little dish from their culture. So I'd have to take a Yorkshire pud, and then bring along the dish. Everybody brings a dish, and then you talk about it. I was telling friends in Corsica about this, and they said, "Oh yes, we do something." In French, they said, "Oh yes, we do something like that." Another group, one of my favourite groups in Rochdale, they came up with this fabulous campaign and slogan: "Who put the tea in Britain?" And they went, very clever, I thought, went out and had tea parties and tea tastings, and obviously asked people about the sort of tea, because you can have Japanese, Chinese, Indian, Ceylon, you name it, green tea, black tea. So I think that looking for opportunities to create human interaction, because that's how you get people to get involved. And I mean, I just think it's essential that where you've got tenants, groups and organisations, you try and get them linking in with trade unions, because they've got common interests. I think they've got common interests. And the more that you get that interaction, the more you extend the knowledge and learning of the people involved. So by all means, social media and all the other things, it's about information exchange, it's about creating opportunities for contact. The other thing to know about involvement, Andy, is that it's like a wave. It goes up and there's lots, and then it comes down. And when it comes down, it's being normal. You can't always be up there on the top with lots happening. It's got to come down, but what you've got to make sure is there's enough in place for it to come back up again. And of all the groups that I watched over the years, it was the opportunities for different sorts of social interaction, including visits to other places, you know, hopping in a minibus and going off and looking at somewhere else. That's what you build on.
Great. Well, thank you, Marianne. That's been really fascinating. And it's reminded me just how many great things the Labour government did. And it's a funny position we're in at the moment, because you keep thinking, oh, great, we're going to be in power at some point soon. Then you remember all the things we've got to put back in place that the Tories have got rid of. For all of those examples, and I agree with you about best value and the Audit Commission. The Audit Commission did an absolutely amazing job and made so much difference to public services. And all of those things that, and the tenant's voice, of course. So it's a challenge for us all to make sure that those things get back into Labour Party policy. We're told that although Keir Starmer said that they were setting aside the 2019 manifesto, when we quiz the front bench about this, they say, well, we don't think that has to apply to housing stuff. So and we said to both Lisa and Andy and Matthew Pennicook when we met them recently, what's in the manifesto in the housing bit was in Housing for the Many, was the result of years and years of work by people including Jack Droney and John Healey, and then John's successors. And there is nothing that we'd throw out. And we had a hand in shaping that, didn't we, all of us in Labour Housing Group. So I'm really hoping that it won't go, and that we really can build on it rather than starting again. And that's what I'm expecting. So I think we have to ask Lisa Mandy and Matthew Pennicook that to be a bit more precise about that when we next meet them. We have, I'm sure people will have seen, we've got a policy day on Saturday, which is about housing standards. There's not really much more room to go there in person, but it's going to be on Zoom. So if you want to join in on Zoom, if you go back to the email about tonight, the email that had all 3 dates in, has the registration for Saturday. And coming back to a point that I think Chris made about the image of social housing, that our next in conversation with is hearing about a piece of research about the stigma that is experienced by social housing tenants. So that's the 2nd of November at 6:30, two academics who've done that bit of research. That should be really interesting, and I think follows on very well from where we've got to tonight. So thank you all for your participation. Thank you so much, Marianne, for a really, really interesting talk, reminding us of all the good things that we had and what we can do to rebuild that, but what we can do as Labour councillors in Labour authorities. So that's great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So see you all again.